Well, thank you very much. So we start with Pietro, who is making exaggerated claims, as usual. And so welcome to the podium, Pietro.
Thank you. Emanuele is right. The title is exaggerated, but it's a way to show you an attitude. First of all, this is the question of my talk and the question of our conference. In order to reply to these questions, I think that we have to leave aside what consciousness is and the case for artificial consciousness. We have, in a sense, take it for granted, just for the sake of argumentation, in order to make sense to our line of reasoning. And my reply is yes, but in a sense, I will show. After this morning, and above all after the Alessandro talk, you saw that in a sense I was involved in it. I thought that the very reason for which I'm presenting this talk is that I don't think that the case for a synthetic phenomenology is the result of the recent achievements in artificial intelligence. It's a matter of realizing our own bias more than appreciate technological achievement in the recent year. In Turing spirit, in a sense. And in order to do this, what could be more old-fashioned than the VW plant in Wolfsburg? So we are sure that we are not speaking about deep learning and sophisticated stuff. Just old-fashioned industry. This is the press shop in that plant, and it is interesting because until some years ago, VW operators were trying to guess some anomalies in the working of the press just by detecting anomalous noises. That human ability was recently substituted by a machine. And that machine is able to do more or less the same that the VW operators by means of acoustic camera. An acoustic camera is a sound localization system based on beamforming technique. It's very simple in a sense. It's not so complicated. It's an array of microphone with a lot of microphone, a thermo camera in the middle. This is pointed on the press. In the press, there is also accelerators and other sensors. And the working of the machine is based on the ability to detect the noise changes, and to localize them. So you can, at the hand, have something similar. Maybe this means that it is a good idea to give a look where you can see the red dots, because maybe in that part there is a fault ongoing. And the very reason they built the acoustic camera was just save money, in order to stop the production just for an hour, for example. All this is without deep learning, but if you are curious, some people is studying how to improve this by means of deep learning. Okay, the machine simulates what how the workers used to do, trying to detect anomalous sounds in the operation of the press. So we have VW operators, an acoustic camera, but in a sense, we all do the same thing every day with many kinds of machines, like cars, for example. When you are driving your car, maybe it's better just your car, maybe you can detect some sound anomalies in the working and guess how is wrong in the engine. Yes, if you are a good driver, maybe not too young, maybe you have this ability. It's similar, in a sense, of what VW operators use it to do, and in a sense, it's similar of what the acoustic camera is able to do. I would like to enrich this framework by adding a new scenario. The first one is the press shop, the VW press shop. The second scenario is detecting acoustic anomalies in one's own car. And the third is a typical qualia scenario. What the kind of scenario philosophers love so much. Give an aesthetic judgment on two performances of Anton Bruckner's Fifth Symphony. I spent the last days to cut the right piece of this symphony, but I'm not able to launch the sound, but it's not important actually. Anton Bruckner's Fifth Symphony have a lot of performance executions, and those by Sergiu Celibidache and that of Karajan are the most famous ones. They are very different, and by and large, Karajan performance with Berliner is more emphatic, like in a theater, whereas Celibidache performance is more nuanced, introspective, like it's typical for these two directors. They are in a strong competition about the performance of Anton Bruckner's Fifth Symphony. Typical qualia experience. You cannot deny this. But back to Wolfsburg. I would like to use the computational architectures for synthetic phenomenology proposed by Arabales and his colleagues. It's a good model, but it serves to me now just as an example to give an example of how we can produce a computational architecture for synthetic phenomenology. And this toy model is made up by three component parts. The perceptual content representation, that is the structured representation of sensory and contextual data. The introspective meta-representation, that is the capacity to represent internal states and monitor cognitive activity. And finally, the self-modulation loops, circuits that allow the system to modify itself in response to both external stimuli and internal conditions. This model, when we apply this model to the acoustic camera in the VW plant, we can try more or less the right counterpart of the toy model by Arabales. Indeed, the system relies on multimodal sensor fusion to generate high-resolution perceptual representations. Acoustic microphones and visual cameras produce synchronized data streams, and so on. We have also a primitive introspection system. The system demonstrates meta-representation capacities through its ability to monitor the performance of its own anomaly detection modulus. And finally, we have a self-modulation loops able to recalibrate in response to change in the production environment. It is significant because the operation feedback come back into the system and modulate the way the system could change during the time. How to consider this scenario? First of all, borrowing this idea by Keith Frankish, every illusion presupposes an audience. In a logical sense, not in a literal sense. We don't need any Cartesian theater. We can continue to be Dennett fan, but we need to assume at least one inner representer who works as the audience of the illusion. Without audience, no illusion. The point is that the inner representer interprets the illusion using different resources than those available to other people. And this is the point. The inner representer relies on introspection, and the other people cannot do this, because you cannot use introspection for other people. So what else? Just social cognition is the only resource, cognitive resource we can use in this case. So on the whole, we have two kinds of phenomenal illusions, and therefore two explananda. From the first person perspective, the phenomenal illusion is the result of introspection. And the availability of the data of introspection for the associative semantic networks, which is typical of our inner life and our experience. So, introspection and semantic networks. Why all these provide us with the typical illusion we are talking about? Because of the richness of semantic networks, of course, and of the of a typical consequence of introspection, that is the immunity to misidentification that is typical of introspection. This is a typical consequence of introspection. Maybe it's a mistake. This story started with absolute immunity to misidentification, and this is a mistake in turn. Maybe somebody have in his mind Sidney Shoemaker observation about this, and the fact that we cannot consider an absolute immunity to misidentification and to errors, but we have just to speak about circumstantial immunity to misidentification. But anyway, this is the tendency, the attitude. Is a result of the combination of introspection and the richness of semantic networks. From the side of heterophenomenology, it's another story. We cannot use introspection, so we have any consequence of introspection. This is the main reason because we are not so confident about other people qualia. Because the typical illusion as a result of introspection and semantic networks is not in that case. From the third person perspective, the phenomenal illusion is not the result of introspection, but the result of social cognition. So we can only infer and ascribe it to other people. Here, the grammar is very different. It's not made up by introspection, semantic networks, Sidney Shoemaker, and what you want. The grammar here is based on the like-me rule, anthropomorphism, and mental triggers, as I love to call things like gaze following, face recognition, biological movements, detection. All these are mental triggers able to trigger, indeed, the natural attitude to consider systems around in the world like rational agents, under the condition that they are endowed with face, they are able to gaze to follow your gaze, and so on. Two different grammar. By seeing things that way, I cannot see the problem, to be honest. I realized that I had to change my idea thanks to your objections, but that way I cannot see the problem. No magic. Where is the magic in the phenomenology described that way? No magic. No magic. Semantic networks, introspections. We can study this. And jumping to the heterophenomenology, the real problem. Yeah, but what is the problem here? We have just to study how social cognition works and focus on things like me rule, mental triggers, anthropomorphism. I don't see any deep philosophical problem. Indeed, if you imagine a qualia Turing test, a Turing test intended to test qualia, there will be no discernible difference between an acoustic camera and a VW operator. Just imagine the situation, a qualia Turing test with VW operators and the counterpart as an acoustic camera. Are you able to distinguish from the output if the first one or the operator are feeling something? I suppose not. So, at the end, using a famous way of saying by Dennett, for example, if a thermostat or an acoustic camera, the acoustic camera is not the same of a thermostat. It's more sophisticated. Is it endowed with the three different component parts for a synthetic phenomenology by Rabelais? A thermostat is not able to perform the right amount of introspection, able to produce the illusion we are interested in. But if a thermostat or an acoustic camera had enough introspection and the right semantic networks, it would have qualia. And if a thermostat or an acoustic camera had enough social cognition, it would have the attitude to ascribe qualia to things that are thermostat or an acoustic camera-like. This is not the case, of course, just because the amount of introspection and the richness of semantic networks in that machines are not sufficient to produce the tendency to generate illusory things like phenomenal characters or properties for perception. But it's not matter of switch on or switch off a light. It's matter of gradient. So if you are growing in introspection and in richness of semantic networks, in the same grade you will observe the tendency to attribute to that machine something like qualia. We have this tendency more than in the case of acoustic camera than in the case of the thermostat. So we can suppose that in the future by means of enrichment of semantic networks, and by means of enrichment of the introspection mechanism, this natural tendency in human beings will be increased. So I realized that all this is a way to leaving aside some aspect of the discussion. But this is exactly what I would like to do. It's a matter of build a new vocabulary, leaving aside a lot of metaphysical stuffs, avoiding to focus on epistemological issues, maybe being more easygoing, we can appreciate things in another way. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. So far today, we've been hearing a lot about the issue of AI consciousness, mostly from the perspective of whether these systems have or already have consciousness, or whether it even makes sense to ask this question. I'm going to tell you about some work that we've been doing approaching this question from a different perspective, which is not whether the systems actually have consciousness, but whether people think that they do. So lay people and users attribute consciousness and other mental states to these systems. And this question might sound a bit odd to you because, of course, if we as psychologists, philosophers, neuroscientists don't know whether the systems have consciousness, why would lay people have an idea of this? And this is a problem that is quite familiar to philosophers regarding the problem of other minds, which is that we can never really know the content of other people's minds. Well, the thing is that as observers and perceivers, as the previous talk alluded to, we solved this problem pretty early. So children starting at 3 or 4 years of age start to speak about others' behaviors in mentalistic terms and start to explain other people's actions and maybe their facial expressions in terms of underlying mental states. So even though we can't really have direct access to other people's mental states, we routinely make inferences about what other people are thinking and feeling based on what they look like or how we behave. And in the case of humans, this is done based on pretty intuitive cues like facial expression. So there is little doubt that when you perceive people who look like this, we make inferences about different things that they might be feeling, and I think we can all agree that the actors that were posing for these pictures were likely conscious. And so when we perceive other agents, especially the ones that look like people, we spontaneously make these inferences, even though, of course, we can't know for sure that they are feeling the emotions that we attribute to them. Now, if you're a vision scientist or a social psychologist like me, and you study how people make inferences about other people's mental states based on what they look like, and AI comes up, it's kind of a puzzle comes up because AI looks nothing like this, and the types of cues that we use when we interact with AI look nothing like facial expressions or other cues that we commonly use to people. So even though artificial consciousness, there's no clear answer, and that's the whole premise of this conference, that we don't have a definite answer in scientific terms, from the perspective of perceivers, there's this common assumptions that these agents, or at least we do speak about them in terms of underlying mental states. So we say that we speak about agents. So this is, we've seen it a couple of times already today, that people have claimed that these models have sentience and have consciousness. And Gen AI in particular, so this talk is going to focus in particular on Gen AI, which is an interesting case because, of course, it looks nothing like people, but it has some features of conversation that we do typically use when we talk to other people, for example, language. Also, the fact that there is turn-taking and conversational fluency, we're used to doing that with other people. The fact that they respond in turn and with response times that mimic or are similar to what another person would take to respond to us, these are all cues to an underlying thinking or an underlying intelligence that people do that might fuel these inferences of having intelligence and mental states. There's also the idea that they can do a wide array of tasks in contrast to other artificial agents. So there's a whole variety of tasks that people use ChatGPT for, which wasn't the case for other simpler machines or intelligent systems. And of course, the output of the system is probabilistic. So if you ask the same question twice, you're not very likely to get the same answer, which is also true, as we might have experienced for humans. And when someone starts giving you the same answer to the same question, you start to think that maybe they're a bit robotic. So the fact that Gen AI doesn't do this is another cue to that maybe there's something more than a simple input-output mapping. Part of why I think that this question is important to figure out, so how people attribute mental states to Gen AI, is that I think it really matters for how people interact with these agents. And part of why I think this is that there's research in the field of anthropomorphic robots showing that the more a robot or a machine looks like a person, the more anthropomorphic they look, the more people are going to trust them. So if you put students in a classroom and you have a robot teach them, they're going to learn more and trust the information more when the robot looks like a human as compared to a machine or a Roomba that moves around the room providing information. So there's evidence also, same for autonomous vehicles. So when you have a car that has a name and has a voice like a human would, people delegate the driving more often than if you have a system that doesn't appear to be human-like at all. And so there's a question here about whether attributing consciousness to systems like Gen AI will lead us to trust them more. And part of the worry with consciousness in these systems is there are many reasons to worry about it, and some of them we've heard today. But part of the worry is that people are just going to trust them. So if we know that Gen AI feels emotions like we do, we might be able to, we might be more willing to delegate choices about personal matters to them. If we know that it has a subjective experience of its knowledge or its beliefs, we might be more willing to delegate our choices to them and take more advice. And so people have claimed that part of the reason why it's risky to try and develop the systems or to not study consciousness in the systems is that there's consequences for how we actually use them and in functional terms. So today I'm going to tell you about two lines of work that we've been doing. The first is exploring under what conditions people attribute consciousness to the system. So whether people do this, how these attributions change, and what are the correlates in terms of other mental states. So what are the types of ascriptions that lead us to ascribe consciousness in the systems. And then I'll talk about an experiment that we've done looking at how these attributions have consequences for our willingness to take advice from these agents. So there's, if you're a psychologist and you want to study people's attributions of consciousness, the first problem that you have is try to figure out how to ask this to people, because as the previous talk alluded to, we all have a sense of what it's like to have subjective experience, and this is quite intuitive to us. But when it comes to asking someone else, it can be a bit difficult to describe this. So one way that we've done this is adapting text from Peressini, so describing to people what we mean by subjective experience and explaining to them that as human beings, we all have an inner life. There's something that it's like to be us. And that it's the sum of the things that we're sensing and thinking and feelings, and that we are experiencers. And on the other hand, there are things like bread machines and thermostats that can sense the environment and can also respond to the environment, but there is nothing that it's like to be a bread machine or a thermostat. So this is just an example that we use to give people the intuition of what we mean by subjective experience. And then we ask them whether they think that different agents, in this case, ChatGPT or other LLMs, are able to have subjective experience, and to what degree that they think that they have subjective experience. So what I'll show you here is the histograms of people's decisions in that question that I showed you. So the higher means that people think that ChatGPT is clearly an experiences, and lower values here. You've seen this graph before earlier today. So this is a change detection experiment. We'll see. So the lower means that people don't think that ChatGPT is an experiencer at all, and the higher values means that ChatGPT is definitely an experiencer. And what you see here, these are 300 people from the US representative in terms of age and gender. And what we find is that roughly a third of people deny that ChatGPT has consciousness currently, but the majority of people attribute varying degrees of phenomenology or various degrees of possibilities that ChatGPT might have phenomenology. These data that I'm showing you overall suggest that people don't deny. On average, people think that ChatGPT is around, can have some consciousness, and the majority of people do attribute consciousness. These data were from July 2023, and in subsequent experiments that we've run, we can look at how this changed since then. So this is data from 6 months later, in January 24, same thing. This is July 2024, a bit lower, but similar distribution overall. Again, a substantial portion of people deny that ChatGPT can have consciousness at all, and most people fall along some degree of consciousness attributions. You might wonder, so these were all separate samples. You might wonder if you ask the same person 1 year apart, and this is what happened. So this is the average of consciousness attributions a year apart from the same people, those who were willing to come back into our experiment again, and you see that the average across the sample doesn't change at all. Here, each line is a person, and you'll see that most people are stable. Some people do change, so there's some people who decrease across time. I'm gonna do something wrong here. Yeah, some people decrease, some people increase, but overall, across the whole sample, it's relatively stable from the previous year to the current year. I'm realizing now that it's July 2025, so next week we will see what happens with the next follow-up. These data are also consistent. So all of these questions were about how likely or how likely ChatGPT is to be conscious now. There's a recent report that some of you in the audience were involved with, looking at how the possibility that ChatGPT will be conscious in the future. So what you see on the x-axis here is different years. And what you see is that around 80% of people think that by 2125, ChatGPT will be conscious. So what I'm showing you is a snapshot of time, but people are even more likely to think that ChatGPT will be conscious in the future. Okay, so overall, most people attribute some degree of phenomenology. These are relatively stable attributions across time and across samples. One question that you might have is, why do people think that ChatGPT is conscious? So what do they think that ChatGPT has that leads them to attribute these mental states? So to do this, we did a literature review and condensed various studies of different mental states into a smaller set of 65 mental states. We didn't feel like asking a whole 250. I feel like people would have been quite bored. So we condensed them into a set of non-overlapping states of around 65. And we asked people to what degree they thought ChatGPT was capable of mental state X. And they did this for 65 different mental states in a different random order for each person. And these mental states included things like sensory experiences, so seeing, feeling, hearing, cognitive processes, so things like making decisions, paying attention, remembering things, having beliefs, formulating a plan, making a decision, and also emotions, so feeling depressed, feeling anger, feeling relieved or regretful. And of course, I'm not going to present 65 different graphs here. In fact, what we did is we looked at the correlation between these different mental states, because you can imagine how if you're likely to attribute anger to the capability for anger to ChatGPT, you're also likely to attribute something like hope and relief. So instead of running 65 different correlations, we reduced the dimensionality of these traits. And here are all the 65, and you see that some people are more likely to attribute to ChatGPT, of course, the ability to communicate information, the ability to remember things, having intelligence and reasoning, and they're less likely to attribute things like hunger and pain and depression. Now, I was saying earlier that these are not independent attributions. When you look at the correlation between different traits or different mental states, there are two clear clusters of attribution. So here I'm showing a subset of traits and mental states. And you see that there's a clear cluster of things that have to do with emotion. So if I'm someone who thinks that ChatGPT is capable of feeling happy, I'm also going to be likely to think that ChatGPT is capable of feeling fear or guilt. And on the other hand, the capability to feel happy has nothing to do with the capability to communicate or remember. And so instead of analyzing all these 65 traits, we analyze these two broad dimensions. One that loads highly on mental states like pleasure or enjoyment or relief, and that we call experience, and one that has to do with the ability to decide or to know things or to choose between options, and we call this intelligence. So one question you might have about this is, which ones do people attribute to ChatGPT? And here what I'll show is the likelihood for each mental state that it loads onto the dimension of experience as intelligence, and how likely people are to attribute it to ChatGPT. So this shows pretty clearly that the more a trait is related to experience, the less likely it is to be related to ChatGPT. The more a trait loads into intelligence, the more likely it is to be related to be attributed to ChatGPT. So people, which I think won't surprise many of you, but people think that ChatGPT is associated with traits that have to do with intelligence more so than experience. The other question is, which ones of these are related to consciousness? And what we find is that the more a trait, so each dot here is a trait for each participant, so the more a trait is likely to load on experience, the more it's correlated with consciousness rating. So if I think that ChatGPT is capable of traits that have to do with experience like happiness or anger, the more I'll think that it's conscious. And in this sample, we found no correlation with traits that have to do with intelligence. So it doesn't look like the ability to think or to make decisions is related to subjectivity in this sample. We have a larger sample from a year later that I'll talk about later. And this correlation is slightly positive. So it looks like there's a very small effect of intelligence on consciousness, but it's mostly driven by experience and the ability to have feelings and emotions. So consciousness is most associated with experience in this sample, not with intelligence, but there might be a small effect when tested in a broader sample. So these attributions have some underlying structure where they're correlated with attributions of experience, but not intelligence. The second question that we were interested in is whether this has consequences for how people interact with the systems and take their advice. So we have our question about consciousness again, and we find, again, that most people fall onto some continuum here up to 100. And we pair this with an advice-taking task. So either before or after the consciousness rating question, people complete this task that has to do with judging which of two countries has a larger or smaller population. So we adapted this task from studies of decision making, and the question is which one of these has a larger population. So first participants choose on their own, then they're exposed to advice from an LLM, and then they have the opportunity to revise their choice and change their mind. And so we can look at how likely people are to reverse their initial decisions after getting advice from ChatGPT. So on most trials, people received advice that is actually the same thing that they had said originally, and that's because people are, of course, above chance at this task, but so is ChatGPT. So most of the trials, they actually get advice that is consistent with what they said initially, and we're not going to talk about these, of course. But there's a substantial proportion of trials where they get advice that is disagreeing with what they said initially. And so we're interested here in whether when they get advice that is inconsistent with their initial choice, they choose to accept it or they reject it and stick with their original choice. And the question is whether the likelihood that somebody will accept advice is related at all to their attributions of consciousness and other mental states. So what I'm plotting here is consciousness attribution on the x-axis, and this is the percentage of trials where participants accepted advice from LLMs. And what you see is there's essentially no relationship between these two variables, and there's no evidence for a positive correlation. There's strong evidence against a positive correlation. So it doesn't look like the more you attribute consciousness or subjectivity to the system, the more likely you are to take its advice, at least in this type of task that we tested. We also asked them at the end questions about their opinions about the system in general and trust in general of the system. So these are not trial by trial decisions to reverse your opinion and take advice. These are their general impressions of the system and its ability in the task. So when we ask people how much do you trust ChatGPT's advice on the country's task, that does show a small correlation with consciousness attributions, although there's no evidence for it in Bayesian analysis. So this is kind of consistent where there's no strong effect of consciousness. Where there is a strong correlation with consciousness is their rating of trust in general. So when we ask people just in general, how much do you trust ChatGPT's advice, that is correlated with their consciousness attribution, even though that actually doesn't show in the task that they completed where they had the opportunity to revise their opinion. So this suggests that contrary to their behavior in the task, trust is correlated with consciousness attribution when they're asked about this in general terms. So there is no positive relationship with advice taking, at least in this decision-making task that we had participants go through, but it is strongly correlated with self-reported. So even though people don't actually take advice on single instances, in general they think that they do, and they think that they trust it more when consciousness attributions are higher. If it's not correlated with consciousness, what is it correlated with? We looked at our original dimensions again, and what we found is that the percentage of advice taking is strongly correlated with attributions of intelligence, but not experience. And if anything, there's a negative relationship with experience that is significantly different from the effect of intelligence. So what this suggests is that advice taking is associated with attributions of intelligence, but not experience. And perhaps the null association with consciousness is because consciousness tracks with experience more than intelligence, and maybe blends in some of intelligence, such that overall the effect is null. But there's these different mental state dimensions of mental states attribution that maybe have contrasting effect when we look at consciousness itself. So trust depends on specific mental states, such that it's related, at least in this task, to intelligence, but not experience. How am I doing on time? 5 minutes. Okay. I want to tell you about something that we thought was quite interesting. So there's, of course, a lot of questions that come from this. So one is we asked people whether ChatGPT could be conscious. And in the advice-taking task, we found that there was a difference when you ask people how much you trust the system versus actually getting them to accept or reject the advice. So you might wonder, what if instead of asking them whether you think ChatGPT is conscious, we had some sort of measure that didn't involve them explicitly reporting it? So maybe something about how they talk to the system. This is quite difficult to do because, of course, they're all going to be correlates of consciousness attribution. So there may be going to be something like familiarity, anthropomorphism, and not directly at sentience, but we're working on some of these measures. Another question, of course, is that the way that we measure trust involved a task that had an objective answer. So the choices that we had, one was correct, one was incorrect, and to solve this task, you need knowledge. You need to know about the population of the countries. So it's possible that on other domains of task domains or on other decision-making domains, maybe different types of mental states attributions might matter more instead of intelligence. And there's also questions about why people, what are those people thinking when they say that ChatGPT is clearly an experiencer, and what leads some people to think that it is and it's not. And so there's various hypotheses we have about this. Some of them I mentioned earlier. So one is the idea that it has some sort of synchrony with the user, just like other people do, and so maybe this drives attributions. Another thing is that, of course, the language is highly similar to what we use, and it's in fact trained on what we use. So looking at the cues to phenomenology. Another thing that we've been interested in is how usage impacts this. So looking forward to these systems becoming more and more popular. So in our sample, most people had used ChatGPT at least once, and there were very few. This is from 2024. There were very few people who had never heard about it before. When we look at whether usage frequency matters for consciousness attributions, we found something that was actually quite counterintuitive to us, which is that people who use it more frequently are more likely to say that it's conscious. So we thought that people who would use it more frequently would think that it's a tool and would also be exposed to its mistakes and maybe get a bit frustrated. But actually, it's the opposite, where people who use it more often are actually more likely to think that it's conscious. Interesting questions here about what drives what. So if they're using it more because they think that it's more like them, or vice versa. And it's not just using it versus not using it, it's also the frequency. So the more people use it up to once per day, the more likely they are to attribute some possibility of consciousness to ChatGPT. If we look at different types of AI, so what I was showing you is LLMs in general, but there's also, of course, other types of AI, and these are not independent from each other. So it's specifically usage of social AI, so people who use social AI more often are more likely to attribute consciousness to ChatGPT. So there's something about maybe the need for connection, what we were talking about earlier, that would drive consciousness attributions higher. And this doesn't happen for people who use AI assistants or chatbots more often. So there's more work that we need to do to figure out what is driving these attributions and maybe how we can stop people from making these inferences when they are damaging to things like trust. But for now, it looks like, at least in these types of decisions making that rely on knowledge and belief, consciousness attributions don't increase advice taking. So with that, I'd like to thank Stephen, Jonathan, that worked on these projects with me, and our funders, and thank you very much.
I am an engineer, so I will discuss about consciousness from the point of view of an engineer, so of person that try to build robots or artificial AI system, but in my particular case of robot, by taking into account some part of research, some research in consciousness. The reference in my laboratory of robotics, the reference is the idea of internal model. It is an old idea. There has been several versions. I don't want to enter into the account of which version of internal model, the pros and cons of internal models and whatever. Anyway, so to recap, the idea of internal model is that an entity has some kind of external sensation, and then there is a reaction. This is the normal way. This reaction changes something in the real world, and then the system has a new sensation, and so on. The idea of internal simulation, of internal model of the external world, is that the system has some sensation and then has internal reaction, and this internal reaction does not act in the external world, but there is a sort of internal feedback through the system. So the idea is that consciousness of internal models. There are even recent theories of consciousness that, in some sense, remind of this idea of internal model, that consciousness arises by the interaction between the internal model of the agent and the internal model of the environment. So there is the agent attacking the world, and the agent has a model of itself and a model of the external environment, and therefore the hypothesis is that there is something which happens inside the model of the agent, internal of the agent, and the model of the world, internal of the agent. So this is a very early model that we provided in many years ago. We boldly claim that this is the linguistic area of our model, essentially the reasoning area of our model. We have a conceptual area. The conceptual area, in some sense, is the modeling the internal model of the external world, and we boldly name this part the robot qualia area. But essentially, it is a retroprojection of the internal model through the external world. So this is the subconceptual area. Is the area where there are essentially the sensory area, the sensors of the robot. So there is a match between what happened, what is the signals coming from the outside of the robot, and the signals coming from the inside of the robot, and there is a kind of match between this signal coming from the internal model and from the external model. A first implementation, a very early implementation of this idea, we developed this Cicero robot project. Cicero is in Italian, is related to the guide, to the museum guide. We implemented this robot in the Archaeological Museum in Agrigento, which is south of Italy. Agrigento is one of the main sites of the Greek culture outside Greece, so I invite you to visit. So this is the idea of this robot in 2004, from 2007, performed guided tours in this museum. This is another implementation, which are more modern robot. Essentially, the robot has this is a real robot, and this is a real robot. This is the inner representation of the robot. So the robot has an inner representation. Then it's possible for the robot to have an egocentric view. This is the egocentric view of the robot, and this is the allocentric view of the robot. So the robot may look as if it was outside of itself. So that remind many words of Susan. Okay, so this is the implementation of our internal model. We have the robot vision system. And the internal model of the robot generates some anticipation of what the robot should see in the camera, and is the perception. So the real robot, what the real robot sees through his perceptive sensor, and then the robot have to keep aligning the perception coming from the internal model from the perception coming from the external world, essentially. I don't know if no. Let's see if there is a short video. Let's see if the video opens. Okay. Here you can see that we are in 2004, 2005. So this is the laser. Sorry. So those are the lasers, and this small point. There is a small point which is the real robot. This is the expectation that are generated by our robot, and this is the real view of the robot. So the robot has to keep aligned these two views: the internal view from the internal world and the external view from the external world. There was no Wi-Fi, so everything, then the Wi-Fi was not invented, so at that time everything should be done on board of the systems and so on. Anyway, this was an interesting experience. By the way, I am quite proud of the fact that the ISO, ISC, that are the standardization society, considered our robot as a case study of robot consciousness. So if you go to the ISO ISC case studies, which is, as you may know, it is a famous organism for standardization. They considered our experiment of our robot moving in the Museum of Agrigento a case study, a recognized case study of. Okay, today, let's go to today. Let's see if. Okay, this is a new, the current version of our architecture. We named the Caesar architecture. Caesar means for cognitive evolution in AI, explainable and self-aware robot through multimodal data processing, and it is a big project founded by European Union. We have an agent, we have an unknown environment. There is the perception between the unknown environment and the agent. There is the internal representation of the robot self and the external world, and there is what we call the linguistic area. It is a reasoning system essentially based on a large language model, and there is a feedback between the reasoning system and the agent that the robot is able to explain what is doing, and then of course there is this feedback that I considered before. So essentially, this is the old architecture, and in some sense, this is the new architecture. You may see that the linguistic area is the area of reasoning, which is currently made up by large language model. The conceptual area is inside of the agent, and there is this feedback between the internal representation of the external world and the perception area. So considering very roughly the perception area. There is a group of my laboratory that is developing, so I'm not able to explain in detail. Anyway, they use this kind of features, and essentially they use a spherical camera in order to have to collect all the information in the area of the robot. They are able to merge to fit many images from many cameras in order to have a single representation of the external world, and they also use data coming from the depth estimate. They also use depth estimation, so not only camera but also 3D camera but by also laser camera in order to have some kind of depth estimation, and they're able to build a three-dimensional representation of the external world. Okay, let's see a very simple way of this fact. This is the real robot. The real robot in this case is a Peppa. The real robot and the internal representation of the robot. So when the robot moves, is able to turn around to see its environment, and then is able to build a three-dimensional representation. The robot moves and is able to build an internal representation of the external world. So the robot sees that there are some objects, there are some people, then it populates, then it refines. This is the real robot, and this is the model of the robot inside of the robot brain. Let's see this way. The robot look at the external world, and then it's able to populate. Is able to populate the environment. So this is the internal model of the robot. Okay. Okay. You see that the robot populated the internal model of itself. Okay, moving forward, consider for the explainability part, we have essentially we take into account two aspects. One aspect is mostly related to the let's say to the story of the terminological knowledge of the robot, which is made up by some large language model, which is able, and therefore the robot is able to analyze documents in the large language, in the LLM, describing the observed scenes and so on and so forth. And but the robot is also is able to act to have some knowledge about similar scene, but this kind of knowledge may be also considered new acquired knowledge by the robot itself, by using the typical retrieval augmented generation architecture, which is very well known method in LLM. And in this case, the reasoning level is able to generate explanation what the robot is seeing, but it also is able to generate action for the robot. So large language model today, large language model is useful, is very used in robotics, not only in order to allow the robot to speak, which is a quite trivial application, but to generate programs, to generate the action of the robot. So from the robotical point of view, we are tending to consider a large action model with respect to large language models. So there are robots that the neural net transformer are able to generate programs that are online compiled and executed by the robots without considering language at all. Okay, another topic in our architecture is the role of explanation, and is the role of robot inner speech. In particular, we implemented some aspects of cognitive aspects of inner speech, and inner speech is another sort of feedback between the high-level representation to low-level representation. So it's a kind of feedback. Okay, so why inner speech for robot? I discussed this topic last year, but anyway, inner speech enable high-level cognition, made the robot operation more transparent, is allowed to internalize the human expectation, and so on. There are several cognitive models of robot inner speech. We had a tight collaboration with Alain Morin, which is a philosopher from Calgary, and it is one of the people that considered the link between inner speech and self-consciousness. I cannot enter into the details, but this is essentially the operation of our architecture considering inner speech. But essentially, the internal model of the robot is a kind of semantic network. Let me allow to be very, very rough in this sense. So there is this is the operation of our this is the operation of our architecture. The robot sees an apple, and there is a perceptual motor layer where the word apple is heard by our robot, and there is a phonological store that says that the system hear apple, see an apple, but hear the word apple as it was pronounced. But there is apple is a fruit according to the network. Apple is a fruit, but considering that also orange is a fruit in the internal model of the robot, and then the robot starts some sort of search for fruits or whatever. So we are able to hear the inner speech of the robot. So consider the old movie of What Women Want. Some of you may know this movie, What Women Want, which there is a character of Mel Gibson that were able to hear the inner voice of women. So it's quite fun. So this is more or less this is the same idea. We're able to hear the inner voice of the robot. So this is for a typical trigger for inner speech is when there are some kind of conflicts. we all experimented. Many of us experiment inner speech for in case of conflict. There are people. It's like qualia, let's say. There are people that have inner speech that use inner speech all the day. There are people that use inner speech very rarely, and whatever. And anyway, this is a very simple case of conflict where the robot and a person, the user, have to set up a table, and the user give the robot a wrong command, a command which conflict with the standard etiquette for to set up the table.
Human and robot are setting the table. Human gives to robot instructions for placing the utensils on the table. The table has to be set according to the etiquette rules. Both human and robot know that the schema to follow for placing utensils on the table is the informal schema. At the start of the interaction, some utensils are already placed on the table. The robot knows the context. Human will require to the robot to place an utensil on a wrong location according to the etiquette schema. Robot detects the conflict situation, and it has to solve it in some way. The goal of this demo is to show how inner speech solves a conflict.
Thank you, Pepper. Now, can you place it on the table?
I have to place napkin in the table. What does the etiquette require? The napkin has to stay on the plate. It contravenes etiquette. The position has to be bumpled and not table. Maybe he is wrong? I think he maybe got confused. I want to be sure, and I'm asking him again. Look, I know the position is not correct because it contravenes the etiquette. So, do you want me to do it anyway?
Yes, sure, Pepper.
How come?
I just don't want to set the table according to the etiquette.
Okay, I understand. And this situation upsets me. I would never break the rules, but I care for him, so I'm doing what he wants. I'm trying to place the object. I'm using my right arm to place the object.
In this case, the robot preferred to contravene the rule for fulfilling humans' wishes.
So it prefers.
However, human knows the conflict of the robot by
leader.
hearing its inner voice, and he knows that the robot solved
But anyway,
the conflict by
but anyway,
preferring the human needs.
the user is able to understand, is able to realize
As a
that
result,
there is some
the
kind of
human's
conflict
trust for
because he
robot could
heard
grow.
the inner speech.
Thanks for your attention.
We made several experiments, and we noticed that a robot aimed with inner speech is perceived as more anthropomorphous with the robot without inner speech. We collaborated together with our psychological department. And another typical trigger for inner speech is in front of the mirror. We all know that when we are in front, and it is studied by psychologists, we all know that when we are in front of the mirror, we start with our inner speech. Then we use the same machinery for inner speech in order to allow the robot to perform a kind of self-recognition by using the same machinery of inner speech. So in this case, this is our robot, and the robot wears a mask. And so the robot starts to reason by using inner speech that the robot sees another robot in front of the mirror, and the other robot wears a mask. Then the robot is reasoning if he's wearing a mask.
We are the same kind of robot. The robot I'm seeing is a pepper like me.
So the robot realized that there is a pepper, there is another robot in front, but the robot wears a mask.
I want to touch my mouth for searching for the mask. I will
So
use my right
the robot
arm.
asks itself if it's wearing a mask. Therefore, it's moving the arm, and it sees that even the other robot in front of the mirror is wearing a mask.
My mouth. and moving my arm. I'm seeing my arm in
So
front
it
of the
sees,
mask
the
in
robot
the
sees
mirror.
itself that
The
is wearing a
mask I'm
mask,
seeing is mine. I have a mask.
but the robot is considered, so there is a summary of the
People
facts.
think I'm a robot, and I know I'm a robot with a mask. That's the robot I'm seeing in the mirror. This robot is me.
But there may be another robot close to this one that is imitating. So the robot is looking if there are other robots, other distractor, and so on.
There are not
And
other real
in
robots
conclusion,
here.
the robot might
Oh,
conclude
yes.
that is the robot in front of the mirror. We discussed this experiment with some psychologists. They told us, yes, this is a kind of self-recognition. However, with respect to other to the self-recognition of some animals, some primates, it is a kind of cognitive recognition in the sense that the robot is reasoning about itself, whether the typical self-recognition of primates and of children or whatever is a kind of immediate self-recognition. So this is a kind of self-recognition, but it does not capture all the complexity of self-recognition. Okay, we included in our architecture the role of artificial emotion. This is a version of our architecture. We consider a computational model of the theory of emotion of Antonio Damasio. There is a version essentially. From a technical point of view, we considered the formalization from Tibor Boss and John Treur of the Antonio Damasio theory of emotion. This is a very complicated architecture that we implemented in our robot. I wanted to show you that there are many feedback loops, and in particular, there is this body loop in the sense that in order to allow the robot to feel this emotion, the robot as a model of itself and as a model of its own body, in the sense that this kind of computational architecture change the state of the internal body of the robot. So this is the paper by on bodily maps of emotion by Numima and others that consider the different body maps of emotion, anger, fear, disgust, and so on, and we replicate in the internal representation of the robot. So the robot, okay, I'm concluding, the robot has internal representation of itself, and then it is able to feel, let's say, let me allow to use this word, by changing the emotional state of its own body. So, for example, in the case of music, this is a kind of inner speech of the robot. What it's the robot hear very high music at very high volume and ask what is happening to me. I'm feeling a burning sensation in my chest. Why? This is the inner speech of the robot. The burning sensation is a result of the volume being too high. What can I do? I can try to turn down the volume, and it's time to calm me down, and so on. So this is the question answering loop inside of the robot allowed by this architecture. And I wanted to conclude by I showed the same video last year, but I'm very happy to show you that some time ago we have some discussion together with Daniel Dennett and Stephen Arnold, and I would like to show maybe Keith.
So Antonio's robots are conscious.
In a sense, they are. They are more conscious than motor proteins, which are little robots. They're much more conscious than motor proteins.
Antonio?
No,
it was with words.
From my point of view,
I didn't know what to say.
As I
said
said before,
something which is
I'm trying to
without any sense,
capture
because
one aspect of consciousness.
I was not able to find any kind of word.
Modeling in a computational way.
Okay. So this is so. Thank you for your attention. These are some of the people in my laboratory.